The Last Voyage of the Lusitania, 18 minutes that changed history. In the cold waters of the North Atlantic, where the Gulf Stream meets the Arctic winds, sailed one of the marvels of modern engineering. The RMS Lusitania rose like a floating cathedral, its 4 smoking funnels cutting through the gray sky of May 1915, while its black hull cleaved the waves with the elegance of a giant swan. Aboard, in the first-class lounges adorned with mahogany wood and golden mirrors, Alfred Vanderbilt adjusted his silk tie, while contemplating the ocean through the large windows of the dining room. The American millionaire had courteously declined the invitation to travel on the Titanic 3 years earlier, a decision that had saved his life then. Now, while savoring his afternoon tea, he could not imagine that destiny had other plans for him. In the smoking room, enveloped in a cloud of Cuban tobacco smoke, Elbert Hubbard conversed animatedly with Charles Frohman about London theaters. Hubbard, the philosopher and writer known for his phrase, "Life is just one damn thing after another," joked about the irony of a pacifist like him traveling in times of war. Frohman, the theatrical magnate who had discovered Peter Pan for Broadway, nodded while thinking about the plays he had scheduled for the London season. Further below, in third class, Marie Depage clutched a small leather bag containing the funds raised in the United States for her hospital in Belgium. The nurse had worked tirelessly for months, giving lectures and organizing benefit events to help the victims of the war devastating her homeland. Her tired eyes reflected the horror stories she had witnessed, but also the iron determination of a woman who had decided that every life saved was worth any risk. While the Lusitania sailed majestically toward Liverpool, 200 feet below the surface of the Irish Sea, another story was unfolding in the claustrophobic gloom of Submarine U-20. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schwieger, a man barely 32 years old with penetrating blue eyes and impeccable Prussian manners, studied the maps spread over the small chart table of his submarine. Schwieger had sailed from Emden 5 days earlier with precise orders: intercept British merchant traffic in Irish waters. He had already sunk 3 smaller ships, but torpedo ammunition was running low and he would have to return to base soon. The air inside the U-20 was stale, permeated with the smell of oil, wet metal, and the sweat of 35 men confined in a space no larger than a train car. The radio operator had intercepted multiple British transmissions, including orders from the Admiralty to merchant ships to avoid certain routes. Among those transmissions, one had particularly caught his attention: references to a large transatlantic approaching the Irish coasts. Schwieger was not a war criminal, at least not in his own perception. He was a Prussian naval officer educated in Germany's most prestigious military academies, a man who had read Goethe and played piano at officers' soirees. But he was also a soldier in a war that had redefined the rules of naval combat. The orders from the German Naval High Command were clear. Any ship sailing under enemy flag in the war zone was a legitimate target. May 7, 1915 dawned misty over the Irish Sea. On the bridge of the Lusitania, Captain William Thomas Turner watched the Irish coast emerge slowly from the morning fog like a green and gold mirage. Turner, a veteran of 40 years sailing the world's oceans, knew these waters like the lines of his own hand. He had commanded the Lusitania on more than 200 transatlantic crossings, but never in such dangerous times. Throughout the morning, he had received wireless messages from the Admiralty in London. Submarines active south of Ireland, warned. The last message received at 11:52. Turner reduced speed and ordered extra vigilance, but couldn't avoid certain frustration. The Lusitania was the fastest passenger ship in the Atlantic. At maximum speed, no German submarine could catch it. However, Cunard Line's orders were clear. Economize coal to reduce operational costs. In the music salon, Mrs. Alice Middleton enjoyed a piano recital while her 6-year-old son, Stuart, ran among the elegant chairs upholstered in red velvet. The family was returning from a vacation in New York, and Stuart was excited about the idea of seeing whales during the voyage. His mother smiled as she watched him press his small nose against the windows, searching the horizon for any sign of marine life. 3 decks below, in the cargo hold, lay silent the 4,200 cases of rifle cartridges and 1,250 cases of artillery shells that the British government had classified as non-explosive material in the cargo manifest. The secret of this military cargo was known only to a handful of Admiralty officials and Cunard Line directors. For the passengers, the Lusitania remained what it had always been, a floating palace that carried them in safety and luxury across the Atlantic. At 2:10 in the afternoon of May 7th, while many passengers enjoyed late lunch in the grand dining room, the fate of the Lusitania was sealed in a fraction of a second. Walter Schwieger, after 3 hours observing the horizon through the periscope of the U-20, finally spotted what he had been waiting for. "Grosser Dampfer voraus," he shouted to his torpedo officer. "Large steamer ahead." Through the periscope lenses, Schwieger contemplated a vision that would be engraved in his memory forever. The unmistakable profile of the Lusitania sailing at reduced speed, barely 11 miles from the Irish coast. Its 4 smoking funnels, its elegant superstructure, and the British flag proudly waving on its mast identified it without a doubt. For 20 crucial minutes, Schwieger kept his submarine in attack position, following the predictable course of the transatlantic liner. Inside the U-20, the men worked in absolute silence. Each one knew what was about to happen, but no one questioned the orders. This was submarine warfare, silent, lethal, and ruthless. "Torpedo los," ordered Schwieger at 2:09. The G7 torpedo, a death machine 3.5 meters long loaded with 165 kilograms of explosives, left the torpedo tube of the U-20 leaving a trail of silver bubbles in its trajectory toward the hull of the Lusitania. For 60 seconds that seemed eternal, the projectile crossed the waters of the Irish Sea at a speed of 40 knots. Aboard the Lusitania, no one noticed the torpedo's wake until it was too late. Oliver Bernard, a theatrical designer smoking on the port deck, was the first to see it. "Torpedo to starboard," he shouted, but his words were lost in the roar of impact. At exactly 2:10, the U-20's torpedo penetrated the Lusitania's hull just below the bridge, in the cargo hold area. The initial explosion was devastating, but what followed was even worse. A second explosion, much more violent than the first, shook the entire ship from keel to funnels. Theories about this second explosion would never be completely resolved. Some would point to coal dust in the bunkers, others to ammunition in the holds. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The Lusitania, which had been designed to resist considerable damage, began listing violently to starboard. The watertight compartments, pride of modern naval engineering, filled with water faster than their designers had anticipated. In the grand dining room, fine porcelain dishes crashed against the walls while tables and chairs slid toward starboard like toys. Passengers who had been quietly enjoying their lunch suddenly found themselves struggling to maintain balance in a world that had gone mad. Marie Depage, who was in her cabin writing a letter to her husband, felt as if the world had split in two. The noise of the explosion was deafening, but what followed was even more terrifying. The deadly silence of a dying ship. On the bridge, Captain Turner watched in horror as his ship transformed from a floating palace into a death trap. The list was so pronounced that it was impossible to walk on the decks without clinging to the railings. The orders he shouted were lost in the chaos of screams, alarms, and the roar of water rushing into the hull's interior. "Lower the lifeboats," he ordered, but soon realized that the ship's list made it impossible to launch half of the emergency craft. The boats on the port side hung uselessly against the hull, while those on starboard swung dangerously over the water. Alfred Vanderbilt emerged from his cabin with his characteristic composure, dressing carefully as if going to a gala dinner. When a crew member offered him a life jacket, he declined politely. "I had decided long ago that if I ever found myself in this situation, I would die like a gentleman." A survivor who heard his words would later say. Instead, Vanderbilt dedicated himself to helping women and children board the lifeboats, carrying babies and consoling desperate mothers. His last heroic act was helping a young mother with 2 small children reach one of the few boats that managed to be successfully launched. Elbert Hubbard and his wife Alice were last seen on the upper deck, holding hands, serenely observing the chaos surrounding them. The philosopher who had written about the inevitability of destiny now faced his own destiny with the stoic calm he had preached throughout his life. Charles Frohman, the theatrical magnate, was on deck with other passengers when someone shouted that the ship was sinking. With an ironic smile that would have been perfect in one of his theaters, Frohman quoted a line from Peter Pan, the play he had brought to success on Broadway. "Why fear death? It is the most beautiful adventure in life." At 2:28, exactly 18 minutes after the torpedo impact, the RMS Lusitania disappeared beneath the waters of the Irish Sea. Its disappearance was so sudden that many witnesses on the Irish coast described the sensation of watching a grotesque magic trick. One moment the ship was there, majestic and apparently indestructible. and the next it had been swallowed by the ocean as if it had never existed. The last images of the Lusitania were heartbreaking. Hundreds of passengers struggling in the freezing water, some clinging to wreckage, others disappearing beneath the waves. The cries for help could be heard miles away, creating a symphony of horror that would resonate in the survivors' memories for the rest of their lives. Oliver Bernard managed to survive by clinging to a piece of wood for more than 3 hours before being rescued by an Irish fishing boat. His account of the sinking included details that were forever engraved in history. "I saw mothers desperately trying to keep their babies above water. I saw elderly men sinking silently, too weak to keep fighting. But I also saw acts of heroism that restored my faith in humanity." Marie Depage was not so fortunate. The nurse who had dedicated her life to saving others perished in the freezing waters of the Atlantic, taking with her the funds she had raised for her hospital in Belgium. Her body was never recovered, becoming one of the 1,198 passengers and crew who found their final grave on the seabed. From the U-20, Walter Schwieger observed through his periscope the agony of the Lusitania. In his war diary he wrote that night, "The ship sank with extraordinary speed. It would have been impossible for me to fire a second torpedo at this crowd of people fighting to save their lives." Those words, written in the solitude of his cabin while the U-20 moved away from the scene of the tragedy, revealed the moral complexity of an act that would change the course of history. Schwieger had fulfilled his military duty, but the weight of having sent more than 1,000 civilians to premature death would haunt him until his own death in combat 2 years later. The sinking of the Lusitania was more than a maritime tragedy. It was the moment when the European war transformed into something different, something darker. In those 18 fatal minutes, the chivalrous rules of naval warfare died along with the passengers of the great transatlantic liner. What emerged from the waters of the Irish Sea was a new type of conflict, where the line between combatants and civilians blurred until it disappeared. The echoes of that explosion would resonate across the Atlantic until reaching the shores of the United States, where they would sow the seeds of a decision that 2 years later would change the balance of World War I. The Lusitania had completed its last voyage, but its legacy was just beginning to be written on the blood-stained pages of 20th century history. In the cold waters where the wreck of the Lusitania now lies, 90 meters below the surface, the remains of the floating palace serve as a silent memorial to the 1,198 souls who perished that May Day. Their stories, heroic and tragic, noble and devastating, continue to emerge from the depths to remind us that in humanity's darkest moments, both barbarity and goodness find ways to manifest with equal intensity. The last voyage of the Lusitania had ended, but its story was just beginning.